Greetings, everybody, and welcome to the 8th episode of the Markademics podcast. I'm Victor Struve, and I'm very excited because today I am welcoming to the podcast Izzy Rosenzweig, and we'll be discussing logistics, e-commerce logistics, Q4 preparation, and many more topics in regards to that. And I think that this is going to be an extremely valuable episode for everyone who is doing e-commerce, regardless where you are in the world. If you're in some way connected to logistics or shipping or whatever, which is basically everyone, you need to watch this episode. Izzy is the founder of Browze, which is a great D2C online store in Canada, and is also the founder of Portless, which we're also going to talk a little bit more about, where you basically cut a lot of shipping costs and delivery times, right, Izzy? So if you have to describe yourself for the people who still don't know you, what would you say in a few sentences?
I would say founder of an e-commerce brand as a merchant. I started as a merchant, grew the business as a merchant, and then fell in love with supply chain. And that's now my passion.
You were the first person on this podcast that's so in love with supply chains. So I think that this is going to be a great episode. So can you tell us a little bit more about Browze and more about Portless, just so that the audience can feel more about like what's your expertise, and then we can get more into the trenches of the issues that are right now popping up in our e-commerce world.
Totally. So I started Browze 10 years ago. Browze is essentially a cross-border commerce business. The examples I usually give to describe what cross-border commerce is, Shein.com is one of the largest, right? They do about $20 billion a year. And fundamentally, they have no physical retail other than pop-up shops. And they ship stuff right near their factories. So they'll ship product from China to all over the world. So where they were building for the fashion space, we were building a very similar model in the home and kitchen space. So our fulfillment center was always in China. We were shipping products all over the world, US usually always being the largest market, UK, Western Europe, Australia, Canada, New Zealand. And we grew that business 100% year over year for about 8 years. We've shipped millions of packages. And it was the cross-border with the niche of home and kitchen. During that time, we got really good at cross-border commerce, and as well, the industry got really good. So we're back when I had started 10 years ago, you'd wait 3-week delivery. The tracking numbers were very often in Chinese. Customers didn't understand it. Very choppy, didn't always work. Versus fast forward 8.5 years, the last 18 to 24 months, delivery is incredibly efficient with 6-day deliveries to the US, 5 days to the UK. Australia, Canada, 7 to 8 days, and only that, all with last mile tracking. So customers make an order, 24 hours later they get a USPS tracking number. From their perspective, it looks like being shipped out of San Diego, LA, New Jersey, etc. So a very local experience, while the actual supply chain is actually happening from overseas. So the consumer, very normal experience to them, 6 business days to the States. But us as a brand, we had tons of advantages as an e-commerce business, but with the main advantage being cash flow. We used to take large risk. In the early days when we got started before cross-border, we used to bring containers in. We'd have to guess. We put $1 million into inventory. A lot of that went to waste. A lot of it sold out really quick and we couldn't restock. But in this model, we were able to be much more agile in inventory and kind of ramp up production on demand. So if something was going well, we'd ramp up production. 2 days post-production from the factory, we're shipping it to our customers. And when we took inventory risk, we avoided wastage because we always tested in small units, and if it worked well, we'd ramp up. So that was the biggest advantage for our business for Browze.com. As well, there was advantages of shipping into the States and Australia. As long as the value is under a certain amount, Australia is $1,000, US is $800, UK is around I think it's 134 pounds. It was duty free as long as it went to the end consumer, as well as container costs. So container costs went away. We had some duty savings, and we were able to ship products quite as long as it's on the lighter side, quite cost effectively to the end consumer. So shipping rates pretty similar to what we used locally with all these added benefits. And it just gave a very healthy cash flow business for ourselves. And that was our Browze.com business. And what ended up happening is we started getting a lot of inbound requests saying, hey, we see what you're doing, mainly from our investors, angels that were in our company, and said, can you talk to some other portfolio companies? Because right now cash flow is everything in this market.
Exactly.
So we ended up talking to a lot of their portfolio companies, and over the course of 8 months, we started onboarding so many different DTC companies where now that actually is our main focus. So the consumer brand is kind of running an autopilot by itself, and now the whole company's focus, how do we help any DTC brand that manufactures in China that's on, let's say, under £5, how do we help them run very cash flow effective businesses? And that's Portless, and that's a big part of our focus right now.
Amazing, and everyone who's watching this has already seen that you're a magician when it comes to logistics, just from basically what you explained. And I see a lot of things popping up right now in our e-commerce industry. But since you're working with many brands right now with Portless, what are you seeing are the biggest issues that most of the companies are facing at the moment when it comes to logistics, when it comes to inventory?
From our perspective, 99% of our customers, cash flow. So we have one example of a customer that their actually product is on the heavier side, not our typical customer.
Yep.
And it's also a little bulkier, which we can handle. We do it, it just costs a little more. So in their specific case, by the time they would land product in the States after container cost, duties, inbound fees, and then pick and pack, which is more expensive, usually locally. And then our shipping rates, which for them, again, it's a little larger, so it's higher than normal, but it was a break even. But for them, it was like, we don't care. We're not looking to save money. We just want better cash flow.
Yeah.
And that's been consistent across, we're working with some private equity
How much
firms.
time did it take them to make that whole process, from ordering stock to shipping it to the US, to getting the whole handling and duties and so on, stocking it, and then potentially selling it? How much time does it typically take for an e-commerce store to do that?
It could range, but your typical boat would be usually at a minimum 30 days and go up to 60 days or greater. And very often what happens is even once it gets to the port, then you get sometimes it gets stuck, then you got to wait to get to the 3PL. Your 3PL has to receive and do it. So we've seen customers could do the fastest 30, but the typical is more closer to 45 and 60 days. And this customer, for example, we had another customer that the reason why they came to us is they brought in a container and they didn't do a proper QA in China. So once it came, they're already falling off. It was like 2 weeks behind. They had orders to fulfill, and the whole thing was defective. And they couldn't believe it. They didn't know what to do. So they're like, in the meantime, they're still getting orders every day because people love their product. They're okay to wait. And they're like, by the time we do go into production and get on a boat, it'll be another 2 months. So we got in touch with them. Someone introduced us. We said, no problem. Go into production. They had a 7-day production. 2 days after their production, we had it in our fulfillment center in Shenzhen. And within 24 hours, we cleared all their backlog. And now they're just constantly restocking with us. So, and not only that, they had backlog in Canada as well as the UK, where historically it would be one boat to the UK, one boat to Canada, one boat to the US. In our scenario, just stock us. We're shipping everywhere equally. It doesn't make a difference where it's going. Just a different label.
And that's a great place to just put as a mark a few points here. You mentioned that lead times are a huge thing which creates cash flow issues. But like, if you have to say which are like the top 3 or top 5 main issues with traditional way of supply chain that's happening for e-commerce brands that are really scaling at the moment, that are successful businesses, they figure out the ads, they figure out everything else, they know how to do creatives, they know how to make a great offer. What are the huge issues that people are getting into with this?
Great question. Great question. And I want to touch on, like, I agree with you that even though DTC lately has had, let's call it a rough name, like people are having a hard time making money, but the demand is there, right? There's $175 billion of DTC revenue in the United States, which means consumers want it. Yep. So you have companies meeting demand, but supply chain is difficult. So if we could solve supply chain, there's a happy world for everyone. Consumers happy, sellers happy. And that's why I'm so passionate. So I would say there's 3 big ones that come to top of mind immediately. One is wastage. In the fashion world, there's something like a statistic that 34% literally to the garbage. Some brands like, oh, we don't want to hit the market and ruin our name. They like burn it. Like there are terrible stories of premium brands like literally burning their inventory, or it's like liquidating it. Or goes on landfills. Wastage to me is stupid, right? Like because you're taking bets, but 34% of fashion to the garbage or liquidation at a loss. To me, that's a huge problem. That's hurting your bottom line. It's really what it isn't doing. In essence, it's you have to raise your costs because of it, and consumers are paying for it. And it's just bad in general to have this wastage. So one is wastage. Two, let's say you do really well. You're November 1st, you're crushing it on a product. Well, now you're going to sell out because you only have a certain amount of money to invest in your inventory. And if by the time you put it on a boat, it's 45, 6 days later. It's done. Christmas has passed, right? So that's another, it's lost opportunity is money. And in this, again, in this model, that helps solve that because you could just restock 7 days later. Yep. And to me, and then obviously the one I keep mentioning is the cash flow side, that even though if you have a certain amount of money that you're putting into inventory, that money isn't working. Now, back in the day when interest rates were low, okay, you could borrow more money, doesn't cost you money. Those interest rates are now 5%, 8%, maybe even higher. So more cost and lost opportunity of the cash that could have been invested in hiring, could have been invested in marketing, in partnerships. So to me, I think those are the three biggest that stick out for me.
And that's something to really consider because for like I've scaled an e-commerce store from 0 to $1 million in 6 months, and I faced such issues. And many people that are getting into the e-commerce world that are great marketers and know how to do the ads. At some point, you are going to face those issues with logistics, with stuff that you're not being taught in any of the courses. No mentor is going to tell you about that stuff when you're starting out, when you're really scaling. You're going to hit a huge wall because you're going to be, okay, I need to order so much for a Q4 right now because I really want to make some more money, but that means that you have to take some loans or whatever, and it's a huge thing. So when it comes to Q4, if you're a traditional brand, you're still not doing what you were doing. How do you plan for this? Like, what are the key steps? What you need to consider when you're planning for a Q4? Because now you need to be planning for a Q4, not in November.
And sorry, this is in the way I see it in our model or in general?
In general.
Okay.
I would say it in general.
Yeah, it is probably one of the hardest things to, at least my experience, right? I only know my experience in my world and in our home and kitchen space. What you're looking at is at least the way we did it. We looked at historical data. We try to understand which products did really well historically. Assume a certain growth rate to those product lines. Make some bets on new ideas, but we can't go too crazy, right? Like, let's say a certain kitchen spatula did well. Okay, we're going to increase it by 20% in our inventory because we think we'll do better. And we're going to take some new ideas and maybe a spatula that has a different material or a spatula with a different design. But that would be a smaller bet, really kind of testing for the following year. So historically, before we moved to our model, that's how we would do it. Safe bets of increases with some new ideas, but to a limit of how much you could invest in at least for us, we were careful with our cash, of how we were able to invest in new ideas. And if they did well, that informed the following year. So it was kind of like a slower learning process, a slower feedback loop, but that's one that worked for us, at least historically.
And what are the potential issues when you're doing this? Like probably you're understocking or overstocking, I can assume.
Basically, like we had one product that I think we sold 240,000 units of. It was in 2020, I believe. And the next year, you just assume you're going to do the same, right? And it wasn't. It was out of vote, right? Like things work. There's trends. They go in and they go out. So we took a larger bet and we got stuck with inventory.
What do you do when you're stuck with inventory? Yeah.
Great question. We tried to liquidate it. We have scenarios where we just donate it because we can't move it anywhere that actually makes sense. And sometimes we'll try, if it's a product that we think we can sell the following year, we'll actually just sit on it and wait for the next year.
Okay, so that's an interesting thing. Why did you donate them, and what are the potential benefits of donating this?
Yeah, so for us, it was those products. We didn't have a ton of inventory. We didn't think that we were going to sell it next year. We just saw clearly this is a product that wasn't going to work. So it would get a tax free for the business. There was an opportunity to do like good with the products that didn't work, and we couldn't liquidate it. So there wasn't much we could do to it. So at least we could do something good with it versus like just throwing the garbage. I just didn't want to throw in the garbage.
Why are people liquidating stock if they can donate it? Is there any logic behind that, or it's just
Yeah, if you get a better price. Like at the end of the day, you're a business, you got to do what's best for your business. So if you could find liquidation, someone's willing to buy it 50 cents on the dollar, 40 cents on the dollar, I would say do it. Like you
so
got
you're actually getting paid for liquidating stock?
Yeah, you get paid for you just get it's much cheaper, unfortunately. Like you don't get
Yes.
the full dollar amount. You hope to take your cost out, maybe even
For
50%
sure.
of your cost. But if you can't liquidate them, what are you going to do? Like you just don't want to throw it out. But for Q4 specifically, in our model, something that we did that we're more agile, because in the cross-border model we could ship 2 days post-production.
Okay.
So in that year 2020, we were coming close to Christmas time. It was I think end of October, already starting to see volume, but we didn't know how high a certain product would go. So what we did was we spoke to the factory. We said, listen, we need to store inventory because we think we're going to crush it. They're like, no problem. If you want X amount of products, I think it was a drone for this product. It'll cost $2.3 million in cost to carry your inventory thinking to sell. We didn't have that type of cash. So we said, okay, give us more details. Like what about this product is expensive? What takes time to ramp up? So they explained that really what they need to do is they need to lock in the raw materials. There was a certain chip that's going to the drone and then certain plastic and certain colors. So I said, okay, instead of committing to a full production product drone, what if we pay for the raw materials? And if it doesn't work, we will take the raw materials, we'll store it to next year. And if it does work, just spit out every 7 days, it was 5,000 drones a week. And that to us went from like an over $2 million investment. I think it was like 50 or 75K for the raw materials that we could use anyway. Exactly. So it was
That's
beautiful.
nothing.
Exactly. So if we protected our downside, if it totally crashed, it was investment 75K. The upside was millions in sales, and it was agile. So as the volume went up, we asked them to ramp up production. They had a certain capacity they could do, and we were trying to constantly, instead of predicting months in advance, we're doing like 2-3 weeks in advance. And that to me was a game changer of how to be like a little strategic with the factory of buying the raw materials to lock in the potential of sales.
And can you do it like with most factories, or that's like something crazy for the world, or
Great question. Great question. For that specifically was one product that was so hot that if we wanted to lock it down, just would have cost so much money. So we only did in that scenario. I would assume we could do with other factories, but every factory is unique, right? Like what does that person want? But I do think if you're a customer and they know you, I would imagine bringing up the question is something they may have seen before.
Because that sounds so smart, because you can, like, that's raw materials. Raw materials, you can even sell them for probably roughly the same price, or maybe even more if it got up in like 3 or 4 months. It might actually go up. So that's extremely smart. Do you still do that for some business, or like do you still say that to people, just lock in the raw materials and like can you do that?
Every once in a while I bring it up. Like we don't do it ourselves anymore because again we're more of a Portless. We have our consumer business running so smoothly. It's not like crazy volume, but it's just very smooth autopilot. But when I talk to other entrepreneurs and we're talking about inventory pain, and I'm like, oh, I've been there. I do bring that up. I'm like, hey, just look into it, talk to your factory, and see if that's something they would do, if it makes sense for you. Obviously, everyone's business is so unique, so it really depends on the business. But I always bring that up when the pain of inventory management comes in.
And in your model, what you're basically saying is, okay, let's just ship it directly from China to the US. Let's not have all of that inventory in the US in a 3PL or our own facilities or whatever. Let's not pay in advance for millions of dollars for stock in order for us to make like what, 20% profit margin at the end of the day or something like that. Like, let's not lock up so much money and risk it up. That sounds so great. Like, it sounds like magic. But like, what are you doing if there's an issue with, let's say, the logistics system when it comes to transportation? Like, what are the potential dangers of the supply chain in a case like this? Because we faced COVID, we faced so many things. We're probably facing like roughly almost war situations in the region. Like, what are the potential downfalls of this?
Yeah, great question. So I think the first part was, let's talk about during COVID time. During COVID time, we were actually interesting positioned because boats were waiting outside the ports for, I think at some point, weeks, versus airlines were actually going on a regular basis. So from a backlog perspective, it actually worked quite well for us. Again, this model is not for every industry. So if you're selling large products, if you're sending, not every product works in this model. Now, another thing is, it gets a little more complex because there is like the standard channel, which is, think of accessories, apparel, things like that. What if you sell cosmetics that let's say are manufactured in China? That's its own special channel. Liquid, its own special channel. Battery product, its own. So it's a little more complex, but it's not, that's something we help our customers with. Like, just tell us your HS code, we know where to send it and what's the right channel for it. And then delivery time, we can't help Amazon sellers. So we know Amazon sellers are like, Amazon's very strict rules, 2-day delivery. If you do 3 days, your ranking goes down. 4 days, 5 days. So right now, so that's our understanding, and we don't usually touch Amazon sellers. We mainly work with DTC brands that give their customers, hey, we'll be there in 5 to 8 days, which is pretty standard in DTC land. So those is a good fit for us. So marketplaces right now, it's possibly could help with some Target. They could work for Target, but we know Amazon, it won't work. It doesn't work for Amazon.
Okay, quite interesting. So what if we have a situation that's similar to COVID? Is it possible for that model to still work, or it's like way too dangerous?
For COVID, I mean, at least from a COVID perspective, that worked really smoothly. Usually what happens during Q4, it increases by like 8 to 9%. But other than that, from a volume perspective, I've only seen it get better and better. And what we've seen is that there's projections where now with 6 business days, it's go down to as fast as 3 business days. So we do think, and when I got started, it was like 3-4 weeks. So I see like literally 100% increases every year of how fast and effective it's gone. But again, it's not for every business. It's got to be on the lighter side. What's your product? What's your HS code? And all that stuff matter.
Okay, so let's get you down into the shoes of someone who has just scaled up to, let's say, 7 figures. He's like, finally, I'm making really great progress, but due to exactly cash flow issues, like I am like completely puzzled how to make everything work with my stock. What are the key elements that you need to think about? First of all, when you were an e-commerce store owner, you've scaled up, you need to plan your inventory. What is the whole thought process? Like, what are the questions that you need to ask yourself?
Great question. The first thing I say is, you're going to want to buy one of my favorite books called Shoe Dogs, just for a therapy session. So Shoe Dogs is the story of Philip Knight, founder of Nike. And when you think of Nike, it's like, oh, the most successful thought of brand in the world. And you read the book and you're like, no, the more successful he got, he almost went out of business like 5 times and begging banks for loans. So it's always good to know you're not alone. And you read that, you're like, oh, this is a therapy book. This is not a book of someone's life. And it's just a great book. I highly recommend it. But when something is scaling up really aggressively, A is, of course, the cash flow, but also a lot of hidden costs, right? Like, okay, I buy the product from China for a certain amount of money, and you estimate what you think you're going to pay landed. What is it going to cost? Think your scale goes up. All of a sudden, your systems are breaking. You got to invest in software. All of a sudden, you need more pick and pack people. You need more customer support people. At one point, we had an enormous team in the Philippines to help us with customer support. And all that costs added up, right? So it was engineers we were hiring. It was customer support people we were hiring, making sure that packaging, if we're investing in custom packaging. So there's a lot of little things that you do to invest into a growing business, which eventually come down to your bottom line. So very often there is economies of scale because you have stronger buying power, you get better shipping rates, but there's a lot of other costs that go up as well. And I think to track every one of those costs really matter because you think you're doing, you think you have a certain gross margin, and if it's less, your whole math goes out the window.
Yeah.
And then another big one is on the marketing side, right? Like if you're not doing perfect attribution at that scale, you could think you're making a certain amount of money per transaction, but maybe there's double attribution. Klaviyo says they made a transaction, but Facebook also did. Wait, did you realize it's the same transaction? And that's very scary to do at scale. because sometimes you're having the money come in, you're immediately investing it. So really just double checking all the little pieces of cost, projecting your costs will probably increase in certain areas like customer support, engineering help, software help, operators, all that stuff, and understanding how to tie that in to your bottom line. And then, but then you also have the strength of your buying power, but then how to use your cash. More successful, Nike always say, when's it landing? When's my shoes gonna land? Everyone wants the shoes, but you need your shoes to sell it. So either it's our model or traditional model, that has to be part of your calculation.
In that regard, are there any softwares that you recommend for like inventory management, or just to make someone to make the life easier of a person like me, for example, who has a lot of inventory and wants to make everything work well and without becoming a logistic professional?
Great question. So, over the last 10 years, when I got started originally, it was like built on Magento. Magento was such a beast. It's scary to even say the word, like how many hours, blood, sweat, and tears to customize that platform. And then eventually we transitioned to Shopify when we're running our consumer business. And you know what, like the interesting thing with Shopify is, and before we moved to Shopify, we actually spent fortunes of money in custom tech stack. Fortunes of money. And really when we looked at Shopify, it got really good. So I would say there's so much in the Shopify ecosystem that just makes sense because you could scale with it from a volume perspective. You don't have to worry about like servers going down. They have apps for $40 a month. You could get incredible data reporting. So for me, using built-in Shopify tools was incredible. Always a huge fan of this tool called Aftership. It lets you understand all of your tracking and the timelines in different countries. That's an incredible tool. There's another app called Data Export. It allows you to manipulate the data inside. So you have raw data from Shopify, but then you could do like run calculations. Mm-hmm. So you're like, okay, my shipping cost is X. This is the weight. I want line items of my landed cost per order based on weight. So there's a lot of those type of reporting tools. Mm-hmm. But actually more and more I've been seeing, we're talking to some really large companies that own many brands. They're moving away from the WMSs of the world and actually going to Shopify, because Shopify is just getting more and more powerful with incredible apps. So the only I guess advice I would say is try to avoid custom. It's usually a really dark black hole and it doesn't end. And try to see what services exist on the Shopify platform.
Well, like outside of those apps, do you have other like that are like really your favorite ones for like management and cash flow? Like, what are you doing?
Management cash flow, there's some accounting softwares that I know our CFO uses. I don't have enough understanding on that side. And I've also, when I was at Shop Talk, there were some really interesting companies building inventory predictions. And I think that's the hardest thing to do. And I'm like, in the world of ChatGPT, in the world of AI, there's got to be amazing software out there. And I went to Shop Talk looking for them. And I was happy to see that they exist. So I don't remember any of them offhand. Because again, we're less on the merchant side and we're more on helping other customers. But I know they are existing, they're coming out. And when I was doing it, was all manual. It was like looking at historical data, having our people like just build reports and macros to understand what we think per item, per category. But from my understanding, there's some really powerful tools coming up that could help do better predictions.
What are the key elements in your opinion for like, you are so experienced in the D2C space. You've seen almost everything in the past 10 years happening in the US and Canada, most importantly. Where do you see all of this going to? Because everyone's talking about a crisis coming, like people are a little bit more conservative when it comes to spending their money and so on. Like, how do you see that happening, and what should people really focus on in times like this?
Great question. And I think the DTC has had I would say a rough name, I would say, over the last 18 months. And you're seeing even publicly traded companies like Warby Parker or it's Casper, right? So I think the days of venture money for the sake of growth and learning how to monetize in the future, I would argue it's over, right? Like those days are done. Yeah. But what's interesting is I wouldn't walk away from the industry, right? Like this industry, to me, the demand says everything. Have we figured out the right answers to demand? We're learning. But there's $176 billion of transactions on DTC brands. That just tells you consumers want more than just generic stuff off Amazon. They want a brand experience. They want to know the company. They want to feel for the company. You got influencers creating really big brands as well. So I think the fact that demand is there, it's always going to be there. And I think where DTC is, over the last 18 months became obvious, it's really about efficiency, running a light, mean team. How do you drive efficiency in every part of your business? Not only supply chain, marketing partnerships with creators versus paid media, new channels, leveraging TikTok, leveraging YouTube. So I think you're going to have merchants that are just getting smarter and smarter, where the early days of just cheap Facebook ads is over.
It's over, yeah.
It's over, right?
It's over.
And people love that wave. But what's the next wave? There's other distribution channels. Now you have underutilized distribution through content creators, right? They're really big, like they're enormous. And most of these content creators are not monetizing well. So figuring out that side is such a big space. There's a lot of players in that space. Finding the right platforms, a lot of new platforms with creators, partnering brands and creators. So that's where I think it's going. DTC isn't going anywhere. Merchants are getting smarter. There are new ways of distribution, new ways of supply chain, and running really lean teams. So I think that's, from my perspective at least, where I think it's going.
Great, and since most of our listeners and viewers of the podcast are typically people who are e-com store owners or marketers in that space, I wanted to ask you this: in our previous conversation with you, you mentioned something about the fact that you were able to really scale up because you found the right people around you, and you talked to the people who actually had even more experience. And you talked about an Alibaba executive in regards to it. Can you tell us a little bit about the story behind it and how you did it? And also, like, how do you find the right people, and what should be your mindset when it comes to that?
Great question. And I tell this every time whenever I talk about how I got started. I got really lucky. Like that, I learned with this, it's pure luck. So how I got started was actually interesting. I was always doing cross-border at one version, and the first way I was doing cross-border before I got exposed to the China opportunity was actually Canada-US. So I live in Toronto, but we had a lot of customers in the US, and we had a lot of customers in Canada when I got started. And this is even before I was doing cross-border direct from factory to consumers. So I was bringing containers, but what I saw was Canada, to ship in Canada is very expensive. To ship from me to my neighbor's house is $8, and ship from me to Vancouver is $15. And the funniest thing was, when I looked at USPS, it actually cost about $5.50 to ship from Buffalo to Toronto, to anywhere in Toronto. And actually, to most of Canada, was within that range. And it blew my mind. And I'm like, what is going on here? And that was my first understanding of like cross-border opportunity. And that kind of boiled down to Canada Post, by its mandate, must be profitable. And USPS is actually not necessarily a profitable entity. I think the U.S. government loses money, but it spurs tons of economy. Maybe it loses money in 100 or 200 million in the industry.
But you make up for it in other ways.
Exactly. There's like tons of business on board now. So, but that was the way it works. But Canada Post had deals with USPS to make cost efficient. So I was actually driving into Buffalo 2 to 3 times a week. So I had my stuff. I would drive it to Buffalo. I would be able to compete with U.S. sellers because I would drive it to Buffalo. Each package worth under $800 duty free. I would drop it off at USPS. Went to the end customer, and I would drive to Buffalo and drop off Canada mail. It would go back into, as backwards as that sound, I drove it to Buffalo to go back into Toronto. So that's how I got started in the business. And I was looking, we were doing a few million of revenue in that model, and I got introduced to an angel group. That angel group, I was actually advised not to go forward with them in the end, just from someone else that had a really bad experience. But someone in the angel group was the former CFO of Alibaba, retired in Toronto. And his name is Samuel. And Samuel reached out to me and says, listen, I know we're not going forward with you, but I love what you're doing. Like, let's connect. And he originally, I asked him to join me as an advisor. And he introduced me to this really whole new evolving space, which again, it wasn't great back then, but it was interesting. Cash flow, all this great costing, lowering costs. Again, end of the day, consumers win. That's what matters. Consumers getting great costing for product. And he introduced me to another guy that used to work at the executive level, him and this other guy report to Jack Ma. and the executive team Alibaba, and he ran Tmall Global for 3 years, ran AliExpress for 3 years, and he was able to introduce me to this whole industry. And again, over 8 years, we were building it out. But that's it. Got lucky. Like got in front of a angel group. Didn't end up going forward with them, but that led to something. Mm-hmm. And I think to me that's a great example of even if like either these podcasts or it's meetups or it's just being helpful to other entrepreneurs, every connection opportunity very often, not always, but very often leads to somewhere else. So it was a no for the angel group, but this guy was exposed to me, and then we got friendly, and then became an investor, and he introduced another guy that started as an advisor, now he's an operator, and it got honestly just very lucky. Spoke.
But what should be your mindset when it comes to this? Like in order for you to accept advice, in order for you to be okay, like to bring another person in one way or another with your company in this way, like what should be your mindset? Because again, let's imagine that the people who are watching us are typically people that have just scaled up. They're in that space. They're not as experienced as you are at the moment for you to be like, that's a no-brainer. But like, what should be your mindset? Like, what's the whole thought process behind it?
Great question. I actually think there's a very fine balance because when you get started, even years later, I still look for advice all the time. And I think you don't know what you don't know, and there's so much of it out there. There's just brilliant people that have so much exposure. So I think always having an open mind, learning from everyone is just a great opportunity. But I would balance that with being a little bit careful because even people that have years of experience, they have years of experience in their vertical. And mm-hmm. you're building something different in your vertical. So you got to be careful of taking advice as fact is very scary. No one's gonna, no matter how early you are in your business, chances are no one's gonna know your business better than you. So always being open for advice and hearing, like be a sponge for information and like, oh, that's interesting. But then taking it and applying it to your business and being okay to say, you know what, I know this guy's recommending this, but I know my business enough that it can actually hurt us. And be okay with that. And I think no one's gonna know your business better than you, but just always being open and helping and being, joining groups and just always learning. I think a balance is important.
And I want to really get you back to the Q4 topic and how to prepare well. So let's imagine the situation. We are right now when we're recording this episode. It's the end of June, and it's probably going to be live in the beginning of July. But you're an e-commerce store owner at the moment in a traditional model. Like, what are you doing at the moment in order to prepare for Q4? What are the steps?
So I haven't done traditional in a while. I'll go back to my old traditional way of thinking. I think it's talking to your factories, making sure stuff that you produced last year is still being produced, because factories move on. If the product's not hot, they move on. If they do produce it, understanding their capacity. So like, okay, if you are producing this product, what's your max capacity a week to produce this product? Then understanding busy season. Saying, okay, you can produce 5,000 a week, but you're not the only customer. So saying, okay, if I definitely want a certain amount of inventory by a certain date, when do I need to start putting these orders in? And because if it gets too close to the season, you can miss it. Like you'd be like, sorry, you might be doing 1 million in Q4, but we have a customer doing 30 million in Q4. Mm-hmm. You just become bottom of the totem pole. So really understanding your factory's capabilities, really understanding their ramp up, their production time, all that stuff is super important. If you're getting involved in a new product line, same story, but then also understand, because it's new to you, what is any restrictions of, do you need any FDA approvals? Do you need, is this a high taxed item for import? Any other unique stuff around that, a different type of bulky item. Lining up your freight forwarding. Am I using Flexport? Am I using another company to lock in my containers in the traditional model? Speaking to them, should I expect increase in cost because you're doing your math today, but your math today is off a $2,500 container today? What if it's $4,500? Does that ruin your math? So understanding your landed costs really well, and then also talking to your local 3PL, saying, hey, I know we're getting towards busy season. When do you need it inbounded by to make this make sense for us, and I shouldn't have any delays? So really prepping all of that, I think takes advanced work, and then how much to buy is all about I think historical, at least for us. Like we were doing less agile inventory management, what was my last year look like? What do I think I could do this year? And maybe you're doing a buffer a little bit higher, or last year wasn't great, maybe you're reducing it a bit.
And you talked about capacity, and you need to really ask your suppliers for this. What are your top questions that you need to ask your supplier for when you're preparing for Q4?
Yeah, I think it's kind of those, for me, those key ones, which is, what is simply your max capacity?
Max
And
capacity.
based on your, like how many of these, unique items could you produce in a given week? And if your product is unique, like you only have one factory, you're very limited to your factory, meaning you have no other choice. But if you have a more broad product that multiple factories always have backups, but don't rely on a phone call. Produce produce a product quality, sample it, making sure all those details are correct, because they say they could do it. You want to see they can do it.
They always say that they can do everything.
You don't want your business, right? I get it. And I think another thing when we talk to factories, especially if it's a new one, we need to understand the specs. If it's closed, what's the thread count? What version is it? Cotton to polyester ratio. Like, it's not enough to say this shirt looks nice. Like, sizing, if you're doing fashion, very different sizing in Asia. You need US sizing. Doing shoes, different sizing. Getting that down pat, knowing that's a huge difference in the local market in the US versus China. Really getting that sizing down pat could be a really big mistake, and we've seen that happen before. So understanding your factory, I'm a big fan of having a backup, making sure the specs and sizing are right. So you're not just relying on it looks nice, or a small is a small. A small is not a small everywhere.
No. It's absolutely not, and I've made it as a consumer that mistake way too many times when I'm ordering from different countries. When should you be considering to have a backup supplier? Like, when are you doing that?
For me, we're doing it, at least on our end, the way we've done it. When we test a product, we don't care. Like, sure, let's test it. It does well. We got the factory. The moment it shows traction, and this is an important item for your business, backups. Sometimes backups of backups as well. Like one main factory, other main factory. And what's nice is as you grow this product, you're also negotiating, right? Because all of a sudden you do your backup and like, 1 second, this is really good quality. I could argue might be better quality. I just saved 15%. Factory A, do you want to match it? Like, I need production, but I also need good pricing. So the moment your product becomes relevant to your business, I think in the early days it's okay to rely on one factory. But once this product is actually an important part of your upcoming business plan of Q4, I'm a fan of backups.
Where do you find the factories in China? How do you find, because it's so hard for people right now to do that. Like, you don't just go to Alibaba and like find factories. Like, what do you do? Where are the sources of that?
So it is hard, but unfortunately still today, Alibaba is your best bet. So if you don't have a team there and you don't have relationships there, Alibaba, at least historically before we built our infrastructure, was our best place. You're going to want to look for the high reviews, the people that have been in business the longest. You're going to want to make sure that they do some deposit and then put the rest post-production, ask for pictures. If you're doing that model, it's still, at least I haven't found a better one. There is other websites which are made for the local market, because Alibaba is built for business international. There's another site called 1688.com, which is built for business locally. And what's interesting is...
Can you repeat that again?
1688. The number is 1688.com. So it's in Mandarin. You can do Google Translate. The problem is the vendors there, a lot of them won't know English. But if you have someone you're working with, like, hey, besides looking at Alibaba, could you also look at 1688? Because there'll be a lot more vendors there. But it's a bit more of an open marketplace, 1688. But you got to look at reviews. Reviews do get tricked, but you always want to buy a sample. Definitely, there's no reviews. You don't want to be the first one buying from a factory. But I still think, as someone outside of China, Alibaba is probably your best bet for an experience. And just look for reviews and been there a long time. Don't be afraid to ask for samples. Like, worst case, they tell you no.
When you're planning out your stocking, and because when I've spoken with suppliers and manufacturers, many times they're saying, okay, but it's gonna take me like 1 month in order to produce all of that stock. Do you recommend for people to get a lot of stock in bulk, or to always make it more fractional. Let's say you don't order 10,000 of a certain product, but you order, let's say, every week to get sent 500 products. So you can always restock. Like, what's better from your experience? Like, how does it work better? And like, in terms of like shipping and costs, how does that affect you?
Great question. So I'm going to break this out, at least from my perspective, in two buckets. Traditional, it's how much cash you got. If you're willing to invest money and it's important to your business, you're not going to do $1 million in sales unless you have $500,000 inventory. You just don't have a choice. So I encourage that model of, invest in your more sure sellers. Be very small in your new creative stuff. If it does well, you'll do it next year. But in the cross-border model, if you're strictly DTC and it fits your model, a big fan of agile inventory. I think inventory cash crunch is really scary. So what I say is, when you used to think of months ahead, first thing to do is look at production time. Whatever that is, then you can think of weeks. So if your production time is apparel, very often it's like 7 days, if it's not custom, then think maybe 3 weeks of inventory and constantly restock. So it's called just-in-time inventory, which is you're tracking your inventory, you're buying 3 weeks of inventory, but every time it hits 2 weeks, or a week and a half, you're automatically going to production again. So that's a very nice way. And in our model, like, we'll inbound all day. We have no inbounding fees. We believe, like, fundamentally for DTC to thrive here, you've got to be so efficient in cash. Now, the only caveat is Q4. So if you're coming to Q4, then you've got to ask the same question, saying, factory, how much can you do in a week? What happens during Q4? What is busy season? Q4 in China is actually, because you're making it for Walmart most of the time, it's actually months ahead of Christmas, right? It's actually, it's probably in July, August, like now, because they're manufacturing for China for Christmas. So very often factory busy times are not your busy times, which might be a good thing. So understanding the busy time, understanding of when it's busy, and even though you have 5,000 capacity, unless you have other customers, do I get 10% of that? Can I get, what do I need to do to secure that? Can I buy raw materials? So as it gets close to Q4, then it's like, sure, just time is awesome, but then you also want to be a little more devil in the details of your factory capacity, backups to capacity. Then I suggest to go a little bigger in inventory.
Okay, so you would absolutely recommend go to Alibaba, pick a few factories, get some samples, and check which of them are producing the best ones. Work with backups, and ask many questions your suppliers, as many as possible, so that you can get the best out of it. And honestly, so many people are not doing this, and I'm also faulty in this, because I'm a marketer. I want to do creatives. I want to do ads. I want to come up with the best angles when it comes to my Facebook ads, and do this and that, and focus on the branding and the website to look better, and never focus on the back end, which has probably lost us hundreds of thousands, if not millions, because of that. But it's so
you're not alone. Everyone does that. So
everyone does that.
Everyone does it. Yeah.
And since we have around like 10 to 15 minutes maximum left, and I always like to ask a few questions that are not so related directly to your business, but related to you as a business person. And wanted to ask you this, like, what are, let's say, the top books that you would recommend people to really read? You mentioned one, but like, what are your top books that you really love?
Great question. So I put them like 3 buckets that come top of mind. There's like, to me, there's like the therapy side of like other people's stories. I love those. So Philip Knight has an incredible book, and I think that's such a great example on Shoe Dogs of you're not alone. The best companies in the world are going through the same problems. There's another one called The Hard Things by Hard Things. I believe his name is Ben Horowitz, one of the founders of Andreessen Horowitz. So he writes a great book of really like the hardships of building a startup. And I think when you go in, the startup is merchants, right? You're starting a store, you're a startup, you're scrappy, you got to do everything. And I think it's, for me, from like just like knowing that this is part of the journey. Like, it's okay, things shit hit the fan, you lose $100,000 by not doing that, that's okay. That's just part of the learning step. You compound it, you learn, and every season you're getting smarter and smarter and more optimized. That's, to me, like just great therapy books if you're in this business. Then for the operating a business, EOS, Entrepreneur's Operating System. To me, that's the best instructions of how you're running meetings, you're setting goals, you're setting the inputs that have to hit those goals, how you run weekly meetings, what are the key metrics to look for. That's just like a great guide to build a really well-structured business. There's a few ones. There's, I think Google has OKRs, but I found EOS to be a really very detailed step-by-step of how to run a business, no matter what business you're in. And I think that one is truly incredible. And then there's another one, which is when you start growing your team, as you grow your team, like one part of that is that there could be, every person's unique, every person's different, bringing different strengths. So getting a team to work together, going in the same direction. There's another book called The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team, which, again, it sounds like, doesn't mean you need to have a dysfunctional team to read it. It's just an overall grade of how you manage your leadership team, how do you build, run the right meetings, making sure everyone is adding their value to deliver the best results of the business. So those are, I'd say, the 4 that come top of mind.
Great, perfect. And another question that I have is, what are your favorite sources of information for business? Like, what are you reading? What are you watching in order for you to stay in the loop and get the best possible information?
Yeah, I think from like a reading perspective, the light reading, Twitter is unbelievable, especially in the consumer and DTC space. So many brilliant people are on Twitter giving just the most incredible content, stuff that you would, it's like learning in the trenches. And these are people, everyone's learning in the trenches. That is an incredible place. And then over the last couple of months, I've joined other communities, which I think maybe it's where we even maybe met. Yeah. And there's 2 communities that are just both incredible. One is called Workspace 6, W6.
Yeah, that's where we're at.
That's where we're on. It is literally a gold mine. Like, the amount of knowledge in there is, you can't buy that knowledge for any money. And there's not one book, and it's live. You have a question, you're posting it, people are answering you. These are people with doing either anywhere from $1 million to $100 million of revenue in your space. Like, what gets better? That is incredible. Love, and it's on a Slack group, so it's so native to how you run your day. There's another one called E-commerce Fuel. That's like more of a database. They have the most incredible case studies, a great community. I think there's like 1,000 people that run the most incredible stuff. So they're more of like a Reddit type of thing. So it's like historical case studies. You search, you'll find old questions that exist. You have a new problem, you post it. People are interactive. They're answering you. And they also have great meetups, right? Going to these key conferences. There's one, Shop Talk was one, Grow New York is another one. And really what it is, you're gathering people that are in your industry and you just learn. And learning at a pace where is just awesome. So huge fan of those communities.
And a big shout out to the Workspace 6 community, because it's been absolutely a revelation, and like great shout out to Sam and Philip for managing everything. Like, you guys have been doing a great job. So if you're watching or listening to this podcast, thank you very much. You're doing an amazing job.
And it's an incredible inclusive community. Like, people post, everyone is answering. So really, from any problem you bump into, huge fan of the community. Sam
absolutely. It's absolutely great. Who are your top people to follow right now in 2023 that in this field, in the e-commerce field?
Yeah, I know Nick Sharma is a really big one. He's always on my Twitter feed.
Yep.
There's a bunch of, I think, key influencers that we follow. I'm not remembering all their names, but I think Twitter is where I really just hang out.
Yep.
From a learning perspective. Besides for it being like the Wild West, and it's great and it's very entertaining. Watching Elon Musk space rockets, but there's actually just so much knowledge. So Nick Sharma comes to mind, but there's a few of these key players, like, their names were not top of mind. But that's where I'm reading consistently.
Great. Well, is there anything, like, to wrap it up, like, what's going to be your biggest advice for people that are entering Q4, that want to really scale their businesses? They're probably good in ads. Like, what's your biggest advice for them?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think this has been like an evolution of the space, where I would say it's no longer 2019, 2020, where the efficiency of ads were so good you could turn a blind eye to a lot of other places. And we touched on this on the topic during our talk today. But I would just double down on that. Like, the efficiencies are not what it used to be. It's much better. It's no longer April through June of 2021. That was a really bad time. Facebook got a lot better. Their algorithms are incredible. The predictions are saying that it'll only get better with AI layered onto these ad networks. So I think we'll see pretty strong efficiencies. But we're no longer in a place where the day one margin is so big that you could turn blind eyes to all these other places. Really devil's in the details, planning your buying, planning your inventory, understanding your attribution. Triple whale, huge fan of triple whale attribution, because if you're attributing wrong, you're going to make a lot of wrong decisions. So really just devil in the details. Marketing is what's going to get the distribution. You're not going to have a business without marketing. So great marketers will win, but don't turn a blind eye to your supply chain, to your attribution, and every other part of the business, because it all matters to blend to have a great business.
And I do have another question. So, and it's probably a stranger one for you, but I think it's going to be interesting for everyone. You were there 10 years ago doing business and doing D2C and doing logistics in 2013, 2014. Where do you see and how do you think that logistics are going to, and like the D2C logistics are going to look like in 2030? Like have your bold prediction for this?
If we have 2 extra minutes, I'll give you a little context.
Yes, we do. Okay. Go ahead. We have it.
So I'll give you a little context why I got into this space, why I'm passionate about it. So my grandfather survived the Holocaust, came to Toronto, Canada. And over the next couple of years, he built a manufacturing business. And back then, there were lots of manufacturers in Toronto, and they all did really well. Probably close to 100 in Toronto. And they were all doing really well. They were manufacturing, selling in Canada, some even export to the States. Back then, that was a big deal. And what happened was, in the 1980s, containers became industrialized, meaning you have ships, containers piled up, where it used to take 2 weeks to unload a boat without containers. Now, if the ports aren't backed up, you can unload a boat in a day, right? And all of a sudden, you can start manufacturing overseas, and that whole thing exploded. And what happened was, many entrepreneurs of that time and factories saw the future, and they started setting up, working with partners overseas, setting up their own factories, finding partners, and they did very well. Because at the end of the day, what they did was they were able to deliver the same product, sometimes better quality, for a better price. And the consumer always wins. So my grandfather ended up going more niche, so he ended up going more high quality, certain size, larger size clothing, and that's how he stayed in business for another 20 years. But by the time, and eventually they wrapped up. But over the next 20 years, there isn't much manufacturing. There's niche manufacturing, which makes sense, niche, specific audience, etc. And now you have big businesses like Walmart and Amazon. They are doing what is now traditional supply chain. Now, to me, I'm seeing this happen again. Like, I grew up with this transition with my grandfather, and my father took over the business. And it made sense when that happened. Like, no one was upset. It made sense. So to me, it's what I think in 2030 is going to happen is you're going to have a smaller world. This world is a lot smaller than we think. And supply chain is getting really efficient. 6 days today, there's plans to be 3-day delivery. So I think it's going to come into 2 buckets. There's going to come, you can't compete against Walmart playing their game. They have to bring in by containers. They got shelves. That's their business model. Even Amazon, next day delivery. They need to bring in containers. There is no way to avoid that. And what's nice is this opportunity of cross-border, I think, will change the entire ecosystem for e-commerce. Today, it's lighter stuff. There's more opportunity for heavier stuff in the future. You got to think different. You got to run differently. And then you could compete both from a branding perspective. You have a unique brand to offer your customers, and you got to think from a different supply chain, because you're not going to win the game playing their supply chain. So that's my thesis. I'm seeing 1980s happen all over again. It will take 10, 15 years. So 2030, there'll be physical retail, same-day delivery bucket, and there'll be, let's call normal DTC, 3 to 5 day delivery, running much leaner, healthier businesses.
We're gonna record another episode in 2030 then, and we'll see if you were right or not.
I hope so.
But jokes aside, it's such an unpredictable world. Who knows? Nobody thought about COVID. Almost nobody in Europe thought about the war. God knows what's gonna happen tomorrow. So we need to stay as flexible as possible. And Izzy, It was such a pleasure to be recording this podcast with you, and I think that you shared so much great information for everyone in our space. And just keep it up. I think that people like you are so valuable. So thank you for always helping the others and being parts of communities like the Workspace 6, because people like you were like gold for us. Because let's say I'm more of the younger generation of e-commerce entrepreneurs, and we need people like you to look up to and learn from you. So thank you
Well,
very much
thank
for
you.
all of
Thank
this.
you for hosting this. Thank you for inviting me. Super appreciative. And I think, honestly, it's everyone should be thanking you, right? You're curating incredible, valuable content. I'm just one person and my little perspective. But I'm excited to see more of your guests because I agree. Content, learning is the only way. And I hope I got you a little excited about supply chain. It's
Oh,
fast moving, makes it fun.
you got me way too actually, because I'm thinking right now, because I'm in Europe and I'm like, okay, can I do something like this in the European manufacturers? Is there anything that I can do about it? But it's a whole new
100%.
topic.
100%. I love it.
Thank you very much, and follow Izzy on LinkedIn. I think that connect with him, and if you want to do something with Portless, if you're manufacturing in China, absolutely, I'm not getting paid for this. There's no paid promotion for this. I just genuinely recommend you to do this because that's the future, guys. And yes, watch all the other episodes of the Markademics podcast, and I will see you very, very soon. Thank you.
Victor, thank you so much. Have a great day. A lot of fun.
Thank you.